Let me again thank you for this perspective. From my point of view, this business of public education is driven by all kinds of forces, but its relationship to economics is often, first of all, not taught. so as practitioners, most of us go through a preparation program and we don't get this kind of diet of information about the purposefulness of education and its intersection with economics. And so I'm hugely appreciative of this opportunity. So let me start this conversation by sort of saying that the data is stunning, right? But my name is Irving, and I'm a student in the state of Mississippi in one of these rural communities. I'm a very successful student. I don't do as well as a student who happens to be white from a rich family, and I want to know why and what we can do about it.
I think my first response to the student would be to define not doing as well. Right, I think that's first, right? So are we talking that you're defining this in terms of not getting similar grades? Are you defining this in terms of your social interactions within the school? Are you defining this in terms of how you visualize materially? That would be my first question. And the reason that I ask those questions is I think we allow folks to generalize what it means to not do well. And then when the student is explaining to me, so if they were to say to me, okay, I'm not doing well academically, I think this is a prime way to begin to have conversations about not to think about absolute, but to think relative in terms of, okay, you're not doing as well here, but is there a subject that you are doing well in?
Hold on. So I'm doing well. I'm doing well academically.
Okay, that misunderstood.
But I would say, in sympathy with what Rhonda's saying, that the doing well academically tends to be measured by taking multiple choice questions.
Right.
And so what the student needs to ask, or the teacher needs to get the student to ask in terms of the narrative that Rhonda is talking about, is what can I do that's not being measured by these standardized tests? And putting that in the framework is that the standardized tests, the things that you can do very standardly, are the things that are being replaced by technology, by smartphones, by computers and so on. You know, just to give you an example that's been well studied, that when you write a check, I guess nobody writes a check anymore because they do credit cards, so that's gone. But the banks used to have a lot of people that entered the checks in the system. The machines now read the checks, and there's no people being employed there. And so the questions that we want to pose of these students is, are there skills? Is there socialization skills that I'm talking about? Do they have ways of interacting with people? That is the importance in getting a good job.
Did you want to? So thank you very much. Let me move on and ask another question of you. So, in rural communities, which is mostly the state of Mississippi, is there guidance and advice on how practitioners might leverage the resources in these rural communities that no longer have the manufacturing plants, agriculture is gone, there are assets in these communities. How do we identify these assets, and how do we leverage them for the purposes of student growth, development, participation in the economy?
That, I think, is the question to really think about in the course of this conference. Because as we talk about skills, and Rhonda gave you data about the skills, they don't really apply to rural areas very much. You have to go to the city to find opportunities to do a lot of these things. Now, if you're in a rural area and your asset is in a house, with the decline in income, the value of that asset may be declining over time. That is to say, if you wanted to pick yourself up and go to the city, yes, you have high home ownership, but no, you cannot translate that into enough money to establish yourself in the city. Even more important, you are within a social community in your rural community, in a church, in a community, with relatives, with grandmothers, with whoever else is around. When you go to the city, unless there are people from your hometown, you go as an individual. That is a really rough transition. And so it is a trade-off there, and it's one that one can be aware of for that. Just telling a story, visiting Mexico, in the south of Mexico, where there were Indian villages and so on, we saw various people kind of hanging on around the side. And what we were told about them is that those were people who had left their villages, but then never really connected to anything in the city. And so they became kind of hangers-on and slum dwellers and so on. That's not what we want to have happen to our students. Here, we're different than Mexico and so on. But it's an instructive thing because they need to have a way to make this move. It's an intellectual move to go to do well in school, but it also may be a spatial move, harking back to Arthur Lewis's dual economy model. And we need to think how we can help the students make that transition.
So I'm going to say I disagree with this notion that the only way to be successful is to leave rural, right? And that's part of what I'm hearing, right? You must leave the rural area and go to the city. So to your question about how do you identify an asset, I think this is where it becomes important about who the teacher is. So is the teacher a newcomer to the community? Or is the teacher someone who is from the community? My recommendations would be the same, and that is to first get to know the community. So know what are the assets, because if I don't know what the assets are, I can't even begin to leverage them. I think the second part is if I'm going to move to the city, there's always this notion that I need to sell my home. I'm going to be radical and say here, how about you could rent your house? Because everybody needs a place to live. And in renting your home, I would argue that that is the first, potentially one of the simplest ways to begin to become an entrepreneur, right? I then begin to generate an income source that I don't necessarily have to work for. So I'm not so sure that it's always, if I'm going to move to the city, that I must sell my home in order to do that. I could rent my house, which allows me to become an entrepreneur. Nor am I convinced that just by moving to the city, I become an island, right? What I understand about Mississippi in particular, that folks already know somebody who has someone in the city. If we think about the Great Migration, black folks went places north where somebody had already gone, right? And so you went and you knew what you were going to expect, and there was a space for you because someone from your hometown was already there. So I'm not so sure that this notion of moving to the city means that you have to be isolated. And I think that if you're going to be in a rural community and thinking about how you're going to leverage assets, you need to know the assets that are there, because that is how you would begin to identify what is the niche or the needs of the community community, and then what are the services that you can begin to provide, i.e. encouraging Johnny to go and do X in the community as a way of generating money, which I also say this is what Charles, I felt like in our conversation last night with Charles Young was constantly being emphasized, right? Sort of looking at the community and creating the opportunities for you, but knowing what the assets are helps with that.
Thank you. That's useful and instructive. So one of the things that emerged both in both presentations is the FTE sector, right? So this is finance, technology, and electronics as the high wage sort of sectors of this epoch that we're living, this era that we're living in. So can either or both of you say something about how in rural communities the new technologies offer new possibilities for people living in poverty?
Well, one way, and I don't know if this is a dominant way in Mississippi because it's certainly my first visit here, is to have access to the internet. And so with the internet, essentially, you can contact all sorts of people. You can get information. You can get learning. You can get things. You can expand your horizon. And so that has two important aspects for a student. One is to enlarge the student's access to knowledge, to ideas, to information, and that's good for the student in getting it. And two, it provides something that may provide a niche for you to earn more resources, earn more in your local community. That is to say that, say, home care workers were in the low end of the earnings, as Rhonda put it. But if you were a home care professional that had a tie, say, to a medical establishment so that you could possibly be licensed to administer some medicines or could kind of recommend diet based on research done somewhere there. You had some skill that you could go. You could then be a higher wage person because you can do more for the people than just lift them up if they can't stand up by themselves, take them to the bathroom, and so on. That is a low-wage operation. But maybe with the internet, you could expand the concept of what you're doing into something where everybody would gain. The people that you're helping would be better off, and you could be earning more because you are doing a higher status job.
So I agree with what Peter says, and also being cognizant of in rural areas, sometimes you have what we call the digital divide, which I had a classmate who said, that's the new redlining, so it's not going to be, but I have internet access, you don't. But I think what we forget is that thing that most of us are attached to, and if we're like our students, you roll over first thing in the morning and you reach for it, right? Because can't live without that phone. And I find, I see a young lady in the back. She's scrolling through, I think that looks like on an iPhone, right? Looking for information. So I'm not so sure that we actually have to think about that it literally has to be the internet, because smartphones are a wonderful resource in terms of finding information. I think the key is, again, altering that narrative that this device isn't about just texting and Instagram and Snapchat and Yik Yak and, what I consider the foolishness of life. But I try to encourage my students that, could you Google for good? Right? Can I get you to Google stuff not just for entertainment? And then I'm amazed when they come in and I'm like, oh, how did you get this done? They were like, oh, I Googled it. wow, could you imagine that you could actually Google and find something on YouTube that would tell you how to actually get something done? So I'm not sure that it literally has to be just the internet, but to get people to think about this phone. And some students are savvy enough that they can develop apps either on the Android platform, which I encourage because under iPhone, they actually, I think there is more scrutiny in terms of what applications they will let through. But you could also have a set of folks who can develop applications that will benefit their communities.
There's a little language problem here because when you're Googling something, you're using the internet. And so on. So, no, that's right. But you can do it on your phone, you can do it on a computer, so on. But the basic point here is not which of the kind of end user technology you're using, but the fact that you can get access through one or another of these devices to that World Wide Web around. Remember, that's what the WWW stands for in these things there. And Googling is a very good way to get information.
So I want to press this thought just a little bit because I'm interested, and I don't know whether my colleagues are, but I'm interested in creating revenue sources, right, with the new technologies, right? I'm completely simpatico with the idea that you can access information. But I think you touched on it, Peter, a little bit when you sort of said, you know, I'm the healthcare worker, I'm the low end. If I could use the technologies to help do some other things or to network with others, I have the potential of moving from low wage to just a little bit higher than that, right? I'm pressing the issue because we've taken these tools, right, these new technologies, based on the internet. Whatever the end user device is not of consequence, but mostly we're using them for instructional purposes, and they've not been leveraged as a resource for participating in high wage activities in rural communities. That's what I'm trying to push on here, right? Is there some prohibition? Is there some opportunity here for folks to use these tools beyond the teaching and learning activity?
So I'm going to think about something that Pam said last night, Ms. Shah said about the difference between the perception of economic development. So just by show of hands, how many of you have actually gone to YouTube to learn how to do something? All right, pretty much everyone. You will notice that for most folks who have a YouTube channel, you can subscribe and there are commercials. So when you ask about how do you monetize this, I can imagine that if I have a woman who's an excellent cook and everybody in the neighborhood knows that she's an excellent cook, I could figure out, and again, I hear what you're saying in terms of the World Wide Web and having access, but most folks are savvy enough to know not to get a cell phone provider that does not work in your neck of the woods, because that is a bad deal. So I could actually use that phone, find Miss Sally, have Miss Sally walk me through how to make collard greens, cornbread, or whatever the case may be, and then there's a subscription, right? So I have a little friend, and she will make crafts at home. And as I understood from her mother, the woman who she follows on YouTube was just sort of doing things to show a friend. And people started following her. Now this woman has 1 million subscribers, and she makes it a point to show you how to take a plastic bottle of that sort and make it into something that is functional for the dollhouse that you have for your child. So I think, as you know, again, that we're not asking people to think about the skills that they have. And even as we're talking about access to the World Wide Web or not, I'm hearing the response being deficit, not one that's from a positive view. If you can cook and there's an access, don't presume that somebody doesn't want to know how to cook whatever it is you're cooking, right? And put that on YouTube. Followables will then make sure that you can have advertisers who come to your site that then put money in your pocket.
So that's the Patti LaBelle pie, right? Am I right about that? I mean, Patti LaBelle, that's not her signature, right? Her signature was not pie making until she put it up on, someone put it up on the net, right? Put it up on a YouTube video. Let me switch the conversation with one more question, then I'm going to open this up so that maybe some of our colleagues can join us. So after World War II, we get the GI Bill, and at least in my head, in my way that I think about the economic history, I'm not in your place, Peter, but it launches an extraordinary period of economic growth in the United States because it brings back all the men from the war. The state and federal government put dollars on the table. Lots of men go to college. Notre Dame explodes. And so talk to me about that kind of investment in education.
Well, first I'll talk about the history. The GI Bill was very good for white GIs, not so nearly good for black and southern poor GIs. This story will sound familiar to you today with current politics of it, is that the southern senators at the time that the bill was being passed made sure that the administration of the bill would be at the state level, not the federal level. And so they went, so in terms of the college education, for example, then whites went to colleges and so on. The blacks could go to colleges, but they couldn't get into the white colleges. They could get into the black colleges, but the black colleges didn't have room to take them. And the state facilities there were not giving them the resources to build extra dorms, to hire extra people, to expand with this demand. And so the effect of the GI Bill on education was very good for white GIs and not anywhere near as good for black GIs. So the answer is yes, if we had the political will to do that. We could do that and have similar kinds of effects. But what I was talking about today is that in our national politics, race has not diminished as a potent political force. And so while it is nice to hope for a GI Bill for Mississippi, in the short run, it won't get you a cup of coffee.
I don't have terribly much to add to that other than to sort of ask the question. As I think about HBCUs in location, they are generally in spaces that were already heavily black, right? So that a large portion of the students would have already been there. There would have been potentially a smaller number of students who would have actually have to commute. That's not my, we have a different reference in terms of thinking about HBCUs. But the thing that I will add to that with GI Bill is for us also to think about ROTC programs, right, where there was officer training. And I think that very few folks know that even when blacks would come home, servicemen come home, they did not have access to ROTC programs. That West Virginia State University is the first HBCU which is not technically by enrollment standards an HBCU anymore to have an ROTC program. So I think as we think about the GI Bill and the benefits for service, there is also ROTC, which would have provided benefits to families when folks were away. So you've got the GI Bill that would have paid for education and given you access to home ownership, but you also have ROTC which would have provided a stipend, right, so that families could have actually afforded to have you away from home. So I say that to say that as we're thinking about various government policies and the impact, they are intertwined and quite complex, even when we're looking at the same population of folks. In this instance, it would have been black servicemen.
But the other thing that is also unmeasured for this is that the better the education, the more curious the student is at the end of it than at the beginning of it. So developing curiosity about all sorts of things, but curiosity is enormously important and feeds back into what Rhonda was saying, because if you're curious and you get information, you get more into socialization, into posing problems, into critical thinking, and so on. But curiosity should be the result of education. It's the end of education, not the beginning of education.
I think the session today was an extraordinary explanation or excavation of what the price of inequality in the state of Mississippi happens to be. And that inequality shows up in schools, and it shows up in the workplace, it shows up in the wealth distribution among citizens in the state, and it also offered up some remedies, things that people could actually do, right, to sort of change the inequalities as they exist in the economic landscape. The biggest thing that happened for me today was it reaffirmed the purpose of the education enterprise, period, right? I mean, we're in education primarily for the purposes of building a strong economy for everyone, not just select people. And I think our presenters today did an exquisite job of helping folks understand why this work needs to be done. It's not being done for the purposes of someone getting a low-wage job. It's for the purposes of elevating the entire economy in local communities and throughout the state of Mississippi. It's an amazing morning from my point of view.
Message here today is that the economy has become divided into the rich and the poor, and the middle class is vanishing. And the way to get from the lower level to the higher level is through education. And so we need to think about what is appropriate for the education of rural Mississippian students, because it's very different than the education of people in the upper quadrant, and one needs a different approach. It's not so much to teach the students as to engage the students.